My grandfather always told me that I need to protect my family and do everything in my power for the family. I remembered it, and when I found out that my wife was brazenly cheating on me with whom I lived for a long time, I took revenge. I glanced at the faded black and white photo that had slipped out of my grandfather's old unit book. I recognized him instantly, dressed in his army uniform, with his hat tilted at a jaunty angle on his head. Standing beside him, her arm looped through his, was an attractive woman wearing a long skirt, blouse, and jacket, typical of the era. On the back of the photo, handwritten, were the words, "Grove and Doris, Hawaii, 1946. Grove was my grandfather's name, Grover Harrison. To me, though, he was always just Pops. But who was Doris, I wondered. I knew it wasn't my grandmother, whose name was Patricia. I'd never heard my grandfather mention anyone named Doris before. Perhaps she was just a girlfriend from his wartime days. I made a mental note to ask him about it the next time I saw him, which would be later that day. I put everything back and headed to my apartment, which occupied the entire basement of my grandfather's house. I had moved in a few months ago at his insistence when he went into a nursing home. It made sense the way he explained it. He wanted someone to look after the house while he was away, and it helped me save money. For several years now, my grandfather had been struggling with various health issues. Thankfully, Alzheimer's and dementia weren't among them. Still, he had reached a point where he could no longer do the things he once could. With my parents gone, there was no one else to provide the care he needed. Sure, he had someone come by weekly to clean and gardeners to tend the yard, but it wasn't enough. I helped as much as I could, though I worked during the week. At this stage, he needed full-time care, especially since he was now confined to a wheelchair. "It's not easy getting around when you're 99 years old, you know," he'd often say in his Minnesota accent. "Things start breaking down around that time." I took a shower, grabbed a quick bite, and made my way to the nursing home. When I arrived, I waved at the nurses at the front desk and signed in. "How's my grandfather doing today?" I asked Julie, the nurse on duty. "As lively as ever," she replied with a smile, and I smiled back. "Did he try to pat you on the rear again?" I asked, half joking. "Of course," she said. "He does it every morning when I bring him his breakfast." I chuckled and made my way to his private room. "Hey, Trey, come on in, son," he said as I knocked on the partially open door. That's me, by the way, Trey Harrison. I stepped in and gave him a manly hug. "Hey, Pops," I greeted him. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Oh, about average," he replied. We chatted for a while about various things, fishing, the news, and the state of the world. Then I pulled out a photo. "What have you got there, son?" he asked. I handed it to him, watching his expression shift. A mix of emotions crossed his face. Sadness, anger, maybe even a hint of guilt. He glanced at it before giving it back. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "It fell out of your old unit book from the war," I said. "I was just curious about who she was. I don't remember you ever mentioning anyone named Doris. Was she a girlfriend or something?" "Something like that," he replied. "I thought I got rid of all her photos. Guess not." "Sorry, I didn't mean to bring up bad memories," I said. "It's fine, son," he said. "I suppose if anyone deserves to know about her, it's you. Grab us a couple of coffees, then close the door, and I'll tell you the story." "Sure, Pops," I agreed. I got us both some coffee, decaf for him, then closed the door and sat back down. While I was up, I discreetly started the voice recorder on my phone, hoping I had enough space to catch everything. "Thanks, kid," he said as I gave him his cup. He paused for a moment. gathering his thoughts before going on. "I need you to know, you're the only person I've ever shared this with. I don't mind if you record it for yourself, but under no circumstances can this be told to anyone else, ever. Got it?" "Of course, Pops," I replied. "I'm recording, but it's just for me." "All right," he said, taking a sip of his coffee and glancing upward for a moment before resuming. Grove's account, transcribed from the audio recording. I suppose I should start from the beginning. It was midway through my junior year of college when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Like many others, I went to enlist, but I was rejected due to my flat feet. They had never caused me trouble before, but I didn't argue. So I returned to school and completed my physics degree. After graduating in 1943, the government surprisingly approached me, asking for my expertise on a new project. Apparently, my flat feet were no longer an issue. I agreed and signed on the dotted line. They quickly put me through officer candidate school, made me a second lieutenant, placed me in the Army Corps of Engineers, and assigned me to something called the Manhattan Project. I was shocked when I learned what it was about. Who could have imagined using nuclear material to make a bomb? It was an exhilarating time. I had the opportunity to work alongside some of the greatest scientists of the era, including J. Robert Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi. I learned more from them than I ever had in college. I was one of over 400 people at the Alamogordo site when the first bomb test took place. We weren't even sure it would work, but it did, and the world changed that day. I was then sent to Tinian, a Pacific island, to help set up and load the bomb intended for Hiroshima. We all hoped it would bring about Japan's surrender. The bomb worked perfectly, but they didn't surrender. 3 days later, we sent another bomb, this time to Nagasaki. We all understood the gravity of the situation. If the bomb failed, or the Japanese refused to surrender, we would have no choice but to send in our troops to take the country by force. And we knew that would lead to extremely high casualties. Thankfully, the bomb worked. The next day, the Japanese offered to surrender. On August 12th, the U.S. agreed to accept the surrender. In early September, the formal surrender ceremony took place. I remained on Tinian for a while, participating in the damage assessment after the Nagasaki attack. I still have nightmares about that. It wasn't just the physical destruction that haunted me, though that was bad enough. It was witnessing the survivors and the struggles they faced. Of course, I was proud that I'd helped end the war, but I was not proud that the bombs I had a hand in delivering had caused the misery of more than 100,000 people. That still weighs on me. I completed my reports and was eventually reassigned to what would become Joint Army-Navy Task Force 1 in February 1946, right around the time news broke about a Soviet spy ring in Canada, which caused some commotion. I went to Hawaii for some R&R, and that's where I met her. She introduced herself as Doris Hastings, originally from Norman, Oklahoma. She was a charming and beautiful woman. We spent a lot of time together, dancing and kissing on the beach. And she could do more than just dance. The way she used her mouth drove me crazy. We had what you'd call a whirlwind romance and got married by a justice of the peace in April 1946. Later that year, I took part in something called Operation Crossroads, which involved 2 nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll. A third test was planned but eventually canceled. I re-enlisted in 1947 and became part of a joint operation for nuclear testing in Nevada. Doris and I moved to Las Vegas, which was only about an hour away from the new test site. Believe me, it was nothing like the city it is today. Anyway, life went on and I thought things were going well between us. But one day in 1948, as I was driving home from the test site, I saw Doris's car parked outside a motel on the edge of town. What was she doing there? I could only think of one reason she'd be at a motel, and it wasn't a good one. I stopped the recording when a nurse knocked on the door. Pops and I looked up as a young woman entered the room. She walked over to my grandfather and smiled warmly. "Ready for your therapy, Mr. Harrison?" she asked. "Only if you're the one taking me," he replied, with a grin and a wink. I couldn't help but smile at the old man flirting with the young nurse. She smiled back, unlocked the brakes on his wheelchair, and started to push him toward the door. "I'll be busy for a bit, son," he told me. "Come back tomorrow and we'll talk more." "Of course, Pops," I said, hugging him goodbye. Then I added to the nurse, "Take good care of my grandfather." "Always," she replied. I left the room and headed home, going through his belongings, trying to find some clue about this woman. I found nothing, just old papers, awards, letters, and commendations, but nothing about this Doris woman, not even a marriage license or any records of a house in Las Vegas. I figured if anything had been left behind, it was probably long gone by now. I checked my watch and remembered I had a date with Karen that night, so I got ready and went to pick her up. We'd been dating exclusively for a few months, and I was getting close to asking the big question. She looked stunning, as always, in a short green dress that highlighted her eyes and fiery red hair. She also showed off what Pops would have called a great pair of legs. As we sat eating at Texas Roadhouse, she looked at me with concern. "Are you okay, Trey?" she asked. "You seem really distracted." "I visited Pops today," I replied. "Is he doing all right?" she asked. "Yeah, still as lively as ever," I said. "Then what's bothering you?" she asked, her face full of concern. "I found this today in one of his old war unit books," I said, pulling a photo from my pocket. She studied it for a moment before speaking. "Is this your grandfather?" she asked. I nodded. "Handsome guy. I can see where you get your looks. He sort of reminds me of Errol Flynn. Who's the woman with him?" "Her name was Doris. Pops said he was married to her before he married my grandmother," I explained. "Funny thing is, I don't recall him ever mentioning her, and my parents never did either. I searched through his stuff, but there's nothing about her. No letters, no notes, no cards. And you know how he kept everything." "That sounds like a mystery," she said. "So are you going to turn into Sam Spade now?" I laughed. "No, but I am curious," I said. "What happened to her?" "Well, I know some people who dig through public records for a living," she said. "I can make a few calls and see what we find, if that'll help. If they were married, something should come up." "What was her name again?" "He said it was Doris Hastings from Norman, Oklahoma," I replied. "Well, if there's anything out there, we'll track it down," she said. "That'd be great," I said. "Thanks." "Any time," she said with a smile. "So what did your grandfather do during the war?" "He says he worked on the Manhattan Project," I said. "Wasn't that the group that dropped the bomb on Japan?" she asked. I nodded. "Wow," she said. "Yeah," I said. "He never talked about it before. I know he worked for the government until the late 60s, then became a teacher. That's how he met my grandmother." "Interesting," Karen said. We dropped the subject and finished eating, then went for a drink and a little dance before returning to my place, where she once again reminded me why I find her so captivating and attractive. The next morning, she woke up early and quietly headed upstairs to prepare a light breakfast for us. After handling my morning routine and putting on my robe, I followed her. When I got upstairs, I saw her wearing nothing but an apron, spreading butter on some bagels. I couldn't resist giving her a playful squeeze and a kiss. "Careful now," she said, laughing as she handed me a bagel. I took it gratefully and poured us both coffee before we sat down at the breakfast nook to eat. "Why are you up so early?" I asked. "I need to get home and get ready for work," she replied. I knew she worked at the DMV, helping people renew vehicle registrations and such. "Why not bring some of your stuff here so you don't have to leave so early?" I suggested. "Trey, that sounds like you're getting serious," she teased with a smile. "Are you sure about this?" "Absolutely," I said, kissing her hand. "I could get used to mornings like this." "Yeah?" she asked. "Well, you know what they say about redheads, right? You've never seen me really mad." "Then I'll have to be on my best behavior," I joked. "You better be," she replied with a grin. "Okay, maybe we could give it a try, if you really want to take things to the next level. So, what's your plan for today?" "I've got a server installation this morning," I said. "Should be done by around 2 o'clock, then I'll head over to see Pops. I want to hear more of his stories." "Sounds good," she said. "I'll be at Mom's after work. She's helping me with a project I've been working on. I'll call you later, okay?" "Works for me," I said. "Tell your mom I said hi." "I will." She smiled. "You know she really likes you." "Yeah, I like her too. She reminds me of you in some ways," I said, making her laugh. "Are we still on for this weekend?" she asked. "You promised me a rematch at mini golf." "Of course," I said. "Maybe we can visit Pops afterward if you want." "Sure," she said, "though you know all he does is stare at my legs." I ran my hand along one of her legs. "Can you blame him?" I said. "I love looking at them too." "You're such a troublemaker," she teased. "Only with you," I replied, making her smile. After we finished eating, she went downstairs, got dressed, and headed out. I gave her a kiss at the door and watched her drive off. Then I went back inside and poured myself a bowl of cereal. Karen was an amazing woman, but she ate like a bird. I finished my cereal and headed downstairs to get ready for the day. I only had one server installation scheduled, which was perfect for me. For the past several years, I've worked as a freelance IT consultant, primarily doing jobs for various computer manufacturers. They provided the hardware, set up the appointments, and I took care of the work and any maintenance the client agreed to. The client paid the manufacturer, and they paid me. The hours were flexible, the pay was excellent, and I liked my boss, the guy I saw in the mirror every morning. The installation went as expected, and by 2 p.m. everything was running smoothly. The client signed off, pleased with the new system. I got into my work truck, scanned the paperwork with my portable scanner, emailed it to the manufacturer, and then headed over to visit Pops. "Hey, Pops," I greeted him with a hug. "How are you?" "Oh, fair to middlin'," he replied in that accent I loved. "I guess you're here to hear more about Doris?" "Yeah," I said. "If that's okay." "Sure," he nodded. "Grab some coffee and I'll tell you more." I poured us each a cup and placed his in the holder attached to his chair. I sat down and turned on my voice recorder. "So where was I?" Pops asked. "You'd just seen Doris's car at the motel for the first time," I reminded him. "Oh, right," he said, closing his eyes for a moment before picking up the story. Grove continues his story. After I spotted Doris's car at the motel that day, I went home feeling completely unsettled. She had never shown any signs of being unhappy in our marriage. She was always loving and affectionate. I had no idea something was wrong. Maybe, I thought, it's true what they say. Husbands are always the last to find out about these things. I knew I needed more information before reacting impulsively. First off, I had to act normal, which was difficult. I was hurt, humiliated, and very upset. It would be hard to interact with her normally if she really was cheating. I also realized I needed to take swift action, given the sensitivity of my position. A situation like this could be used against me by a hostile foreign power. During security briefings, I had learned this was exactly the kind of thing the Reds like to exploit for blackmail. I grabbed the phone book and looked for a private investigator. I found one named James Ham and called his office. His receptionist transferred me to him, and I arranged a meeting for first thing in the morning. My next call was to my boss. I explained the situation, and he agreed that I needed to sort it out. So he gave me the day off. Soon after, Doris arrived home. She walked in with a bag of groceries and set them on the kitchen counter. I looked her over, but nothing seemed off. Her clothes were tidy, her makeup was intact, and her hair looked just as it had when I last saw her. She kissed me on the cheek, and I didn't notice any strange scents. "So, how was your day?" she asked. "Okay, I guess," I replied. Since my work was classified, I often kept my responses vague. "Just handling things as they come up. How was yours?" "Same here," she said. "I did some shopping and picked up stuff for dinner." "So you didn't go anywhere else or see anyone today?" I asked. "No, nothing else," she said. "Why?" I couldn't believe it. She just lied to my face. How long had this been going on, I wondered. "Oh, nothing, I was just curious," I said. Damn. What are your plans for tomorrow?" "Probably more of the same," she said. "I'll bet," I thought to myself. I changed into casual clothes and sat down with her for dinner. Afterward, we poured some sherry and settled in to watch TV. We had one of the early mass-produced sets, an old RCA. Back then, there wasn't much on, not like today, but we enjoyed craft television theater. Milton Berle was another favorite, and I liked Superman and The Life of Riley. Candid Camera also came out around that time, I think. They sure don't make shows like that anymore, I tell you. After watching some television, we went to bed. That night, I struggled to act normal with her, but I managed. I think Doris sensed something was off, but she never mentioned it. The next morning, we had breakfast as usual. I put on my uniform, grabbed a cup of coffee, and headed out. To avoid raising any suspicions, I stopped by a diner for a coffee before my meeting with James. When I arrived at his office, a blonde receptionist chewing gum showed me in. James greeted me with a handshake, then sat back down, lit a cigarette, and studied me through the smoke. "So what brings you here today, Captain Harrison?" he asked, checking a paper on his desk. I mentioned seeing Doris's car at the motel and hinted that my work was sensitive, without specifying further. "So you think your wife might be unfaithful and want me to investigate? Is that right?" he asked. "Yes, that's correct," I replied. "All right," he said. "Give me everything you have on her. A photo, her car make and model, license plate, and so on. I'll need about a week to dig into it. I'll gather as much information as possible, reaching out to some contacts in Hawaii and Oklahoma. It might take a few days and cost a bit more, if that's all right with you." "Yes, that's fine," I said. "You have to understand, we didn't have the advanced technology you have today. Back then, a detective had to work hard to uncover the truth." I provided him with details about her car, the color, make, and license plate number, and then handed him a photo. It was the same one you found, actually. He looked at it with a furrowed brow, which I didn't understand at the time, but would later. "All right," James said. "In the meantime, don't do anything rash. Let me handle this. It might turn out to be nothing. Maybe she's just meeting an old friend or a family member." Are you thinking about a divorce? I'm not sure, I replied. It depends on what you discover. Okay, he said, giving me a business card. This is a lawyer I highly recommend. My receptionist will manage the retainer. I like to have something up front to start. And then I'll bill you for the rest once I'm finished. Is that all right? Yes, that works for me, I said. Call me in about 10 days, and I should have a full report for you, he said. Thank you, Mr. Ham, I said. You're welcome, and good luck, Captain, he replied, standing up and extending his hand. I shook it, then left and settled the bill with the receptionist. I looked at the card and asked for directions, which the receptionist was more than happy to give. I drove to a small house on the edge of downtown with a sign that read, Wilbur Capshaw, Attorney at Law. Divorces handled here quickly. At that time, Nevada was known as the divorce capital of the country. I parked my car and went inside, where a blonde receptionist led me to Wilbur Capshaw, Esquire's office. I couldn't help but wonder if blonde receptionists were in abundance here. Wilbur greeted me with a handshake and motioned for me to sit down. What can I do for you today, Captain? He inquired. Well, I began, I'm considering a divorce and was hoping to understand my options. You've come to the right place, he replied. Are you looking for a quick Reno divorce? I'd prefer it to be quick, I said. I can definitely handle that for you, he assured. On what grounds are you looking to file for divorce? Possibly adultery, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure yet. Oh, he asked. Why not? Well, I don't have any definitive proof at the moment, I explained. I'm having someone investigate it for me. By someone? Do you mean Mr. Ham? He asked. He called to say you might be coming by. I do a lot of business with him. Yes, that's right, I confirmed. He nodded. So, how does this process work? I asked. How long have you been in Nevada? He inquired. Several months, I replied, since I was assigned here last year. Great, Wilbur said. Residency isn't an issue then. According to the law, you need to have lived here for just 6 weeks. Can you get someone to attest to your residency? Absolutely, I affirmed. Perfect, he said. Here's how it works. Once you decide to proceed, come see me. I'll handle the paperwork, file it, and arrange for her to be served. Then I'll set up an attorney in Reno to represent you in court. You'll need to get there on your own by car or train. I assume you have a car? Yes, I do, I replied, nodding. Once you're there, you'll go to the courthouse. You or your attorney will present your case, and if she doesn't contest it, you'll leave a few minutes later with your divorce decree. If you like, you can even throw your wedding ring into the Truckee River afterward. Just like that? I asked. Pretty much, he said. Well, I'd like to see what Mr. Ham finds out first, I said. I understand, Wilbur said. You don't want to rush into things, but just so you know, you can still go through with the divorce. I even know someone who divorced his wife because she wouldn't let him listen to the radio. Seriously? I asked. Yeah, Wilbur replied. He called it cruelty, believe it or not. Take your time, make sure this is what you really want, and then come see me. I'll be here. Thank you, Mr. Capshaw, I said. I might just do that. My pleasure, Captain, he said, rising from his seat. We shook hands, and I left. Back in my car, I realized it was lunchtime, so I headed back to the diner to eat and think through my options. As I ate, I reflected on what might have gone wrong. I always put her needs first and did my best to treat her with respect and love. How could she have done this? Before I knew it, it was already 2 p.m. I couldn't sit there all day, and I wasn't in the mood to get drunk. I had an idea and decided to head out after paying my bill and leaving a generous tip for the patient waitress. I drove by the motel where I had seen her car before, but it wasn't there. Good, I thought. I decided to go home and surprise her. However, when I arrived at our house, I saw an unfamiliar car with California plates parked in front. I pulled into the driveway next to Doris's car and headed for the door. Pops and I both looked up when we heard a knock on the door, interrupting his story. I turned off the recording as a nurse poked her head in. "It's time to get you ready for dinner, Mr. Harrison," she said with a smile. He returned the smile. "All ready?" he asked. "Time sure flies when you're having fun." I stood up and gave Pops a hug. "I should get going then," I said. "I'll come by tomorrow, if that's all right." "That's more than all right, son," he replied. "See you then?" I nodded to the nurse as I left and headed home. Once I got home, I checked my schedule for the next day, which was Friday. I didn't have any installations planned, but I did have some maintenance work that I could handle remotely. I sat down at my computer and started searching. I came across several old articles mentioning James Ham and discovered that he had served in the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, during the war. From a documentary I'd seen on the History Channel, I knew that the OSS was the precursor to the CIA. I also found information about Capshaw, a divorce lawyer who made a fortune facilitating quick divorces in the 1940s and 1950s. I want to be clear. I never doubted my grandfather. I was just looking for anything that could support his story. After dinner, Karen called. She was at her mother's house working on one of her knitting and crocheting projects, often seeking help from her mother, who was an expert. "So, how did your visit with your grandfather go today?" she inquired. "It went well," I replied. "I'll probably stop by again tomorrow afternoon after I'm done with my tasks." "All right," she said. "Don't forget we have plans for tomorrow night." "How could I forget something like that?" I joked. She laughed. "By the way, Mom says hi," she added. I heard her mother in the background shout, "Hi, Trey." I chuckled. "Give your mother my regards," I told Karen. I could hear her relay the message. "Trey says hi, Mom," Karen said, then returned to the conversation. "Also, Trey Harrison," she began. "I want you to know that I love you. I might not say it as often as I should, but I really do." "I love you too, Karen," I responded. Karen had been hurt before and wasn't quick to express her feelings, so I felt truly fortunate that she felt comfortable sharing that with me. The truth is, I really do love her. "I'll see you tomorrow night, all right?" she asked. "I'll see you then," I agreed. We said our goodbyes and ended the call. The following day, I wrapped up my work earlier than expected. I took some time to review my schedule for the upcoming week, sent out my timesheets for payment, and then went to visit Pops to hear the rest of his story. Upon arriving at the nursing home, I greeted Julie with a smile as I signed in and then proceeded to Pops's room. I gave him his usual hug, made coffee for both of us, and set his cup in the holder. "So, how are things going with that redhead?" he asked. "What's her name?" "Karen?" "Yes, Pops, it's Karen, and things are going really well," I replied. "Are you thinking about marrying her?" Pops inquired. I nodded. "I think so, Pops," I said. He nodded and smiled. "You know, I'd be perfectly fine if you wanted to, move her into the old place," he said with a wink. "You mean live in sin?" I teased, pretending to be shocked. He chuckled. "I may be old, but I'm not foolish," he said. "She's a good influence on you, son, and I know your grandmother would approve too." "Thanks, Pops," I said. "I just wish Mom and Dad were still around." He smiled and patted my knee. "I know, son," he said. "So do I." But it's time you started focusing on your future. And I think Karen should be part of that. But I guess that's not why you're really here, is it? I smiled at that. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. Now, where was I? You had just arrived home and noticed a strange car parked out front, I said. Having read similar scenarios in online stories, I was familiar with the strange car trope. Oh yes, he said. He gave me a moment to start recording before continuing. I parked my car and took a deep breath before entering the house, wondering what I would find. Would she be in his arms? Would they be having intimacy in my bed? Summoning my courage, I stepped out of the car and walked inside, unsure of what awaited me. Upon entering, I saw a tall, well-built man in a dark suit seated on the couch. He rose as I came in. Doris was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She emerged when she heard the door and was wiping her hands on her apron, which was tied around her house dress. "Grove, you're home early," she said. "I was just starting dinner. Please meet my cousin, Michael J. Smith from Ardmore, Oklahoma. Mike, this is my husband, Grove." The man extended his hand and I shook it reluctantly. I noticed a smear of lipstick on his mouth and a faint scar on his right cheek. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," he said, speaking flawless English. I had expected a slight Western accent from someone from Oklahoma, but there was none. I found it peculiar, though I hadn't met many people from Oklahoma before. "A pleasure to meet you, Mike," I replied. "Please have a seat. I'm just going to change out of this uniform, if you don't mind." "Not at all," he said, with a smile. There was something about that smile that made me uneasy. I couldn't quite place it, but it left me feeling uncomfortable. I went to my office, set my briefcase down, and made sure it was locked. After securing the door, I headed to the master bedroom to change. While I was there, I listened for any conversation, but heard nothing. I looked around but found no signs of their presence. After changing out of my uniform, I returned to the front room and poured myself a drink, noticing that Mike had already helped himself. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "Doris told me I should help myself." "Well, as you're her cousin, I don't see any reason to object," I replied. "How does that saying go? Mi casa es su casa." Mike looked puzzled for a moment, as if he'd never heard it before, but then he understood. "Oh, well, thank you," he said. We settled in the front room while Doris stayed in the kitchen. "So, what do you do, Mike?" I asked. "And what brings you to Las Vegas?" "Well, I'm a salesman," he said. "I'm on the road a lot. I'm just passing through on my way to Reno. I'm sure it's not as exciting as what you do," he added, trying to prompt me to boast about my job. "I'm not so sure," I replied. "You get to travel and see new places all the time. I'm stuck with the same old routine every day. So what do you sell?" "Mainly building supplies," he said. "Nothing retail, just for contractors. You'd be surprised at how much construction has happened since the war." "I noticed the scar," I said. "Were you in the war?" "Yes," he replied. "I got this from a German bullet. Were you in the war?" "Yes," I said. "I was stationed in the Pacific Theater. I probably didn't see as much action as you did in Europe." He shrugged. "We all did our part," he said. Doris then came out and called us to the table. As we ate, I think I observed them almost as closely as they were observing me. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe they weren't really cousins, and that their story was just a ploy to mislead me. After we finished, Mike stood up and gave Doris a kiss on the cheek. I noticed the way she looked at him. Something felt off. "That was wonderful," he said. "We should do this again sometime." He turned to me, extending his hand, which I shook. I must be going now. Thank you for the dinner, Grove. It was a pleasure meeting you. Likewise, I replied. After he left, I helped Doris clear the table, then poured us both a drink and we sat down in the front room. Your cousin seems like a nice guy, I remarked when she took a seat. Yes, thank you, she replied. You two seem pretty close, I observed. We've always been close, she said. I haven't seen him since he went off to war. I responded. She gave me a curious look. You seem a bit preoccupied, she said. Is everything all right? Yes, of course, I assured her. Just mulling over something that recently came up. I'll sort it out. She smiled and nestled into my arms, acting as though everything was normal. In the following days, I was on edge, waiting to hear what James had discovered. I had given him all the information I had on Mike, a description, details about his car, and the California license plates. He nodded appreciatively when I finished. Thanks, Captain Harrison, he said. This will be very helpful. A few days later, I reached out to James to see if he had any updates for me. Actually, I do, Captain, he replied. Could you stop by my office on your way home today? I'll be there, I assured him. I left work a bit early and visited his office, where the receptionist let me in right away. It's good to see you, Captain, James said as he lit a cigarette. So what did you find out? I asked, my curiosity piqued. Several things, he responded. First, my colleague in Hawaii checked the records. Did you see the justice who performed your wedding sign the license? No, I replied. It was signed when I looked at it, though. He mentioned he would file it for me. Well, it turns out no marriage certificate was ever filed, James informed me. In fact, the justice who allegedly married you was found dead from a gunshot wound a few days after your wedding. As far as the authorities there are concerned, you were never married. What? I exclaimed. There's more, he continued. The woman you know as Doris Hastings is actually Russian. Really? I asked, surprised. Are you certain? Absolutely, he confirmed. I recognized her from the photo you provided. Her real name is Svetlana Fedorova, and she's a KGB agent. I last saw her in Bavaria towards the end of the war. I thought she had been killed, but apparently not. The man you know as Michael Smith is actually Michael Schmidt, formerly with the Waffen-SS. The intel community believed he was recruited as a double agent by Fedorova and went to the Soviet Union after the war. This is unbelievable, I said. We might need to contact the FBI or someone. Normally, I would agree, James said, but involving them might cause you a lot of trouble. Being deceived by a Soviet spy could reflect poorly on your record and might jeopardize your clearance and job. But I had no idea she was Russian, I protested. It doesn't matter, James said. I suspect they've targeted you for something, though I'm not sure what. What I do know is that they plan to kill you once their mission is complete. And they've been quite active. He then showed me a few black and white photos of them together in a motel room. I asked, "How did you get these?" James replied, "It's better if you don't know." But that's not the biggest issue. Since there's no official record of your marriage, you can't divorce her. So what should we do? I inquired. I've got a plan that will solve everything, he said with a cunning smile. We spent the next hour or so discussing and strategizing. Pops paused and looked up at me before he spoke. I noticed a hint of guilt and shame on his face. I stopped the recording. "Is everything okay, Pops?" I asked. "This next part is the toughest part of the whole story," he said. "I just hope you won't judge me harshly afterward." "Pops, there's nothing you can say that will change how I feel about you," I replied. He nodded. "I hope that's true, son," he said. "I want you to know that I'm not proud of what I did." "That's all right, Pops," I reassured him. "All right, son. Here we go," he said. I restarted the recording and waited for him to continue. I waited for the day of our next test, just as James and I had planned. He had been keeping a close watch on both Doris, Svetlana, and Mike, and had their routine figured out. It appeared that Mike had a motel room, and Doris visited him almost every day. I called James, and he told me that they were currently in the motel room and would likely stay there for a few hours. It was common for me to return home in a government truck, which I frequently used for setting up test sites. Part of my role involved ensuring everything was prepared for each test, making me the last person on site before the detonation. When James informed me of their location, I made sure I had the equipment we had discussed. I went to the motel and met James. Fortunately, their room was on the first floor and at the back of the motel, so no one would see us entering or exiting, he said. As planned, I wore green overalls and a cap to avoid being recognized as an Army officer. "Shh," James whispered as I stepped out of the truck. "They're asleep right now. Get everything ready while I take care of them." I nodded and quietly opened the back of the truck. I pulled out a ramp, secured it, and then opened a metal box that was already inside. When I turned around, James had Doris/Svetlana in a burlap sack slung over his shoulder. He dropped her into the box. "Is she—" I started, but he shook his head. "No, but she'll be out for several hours," he said. "I'll be back in a moment." A few minutes later, he returned with Mike and placed him next to her in the box. He gathered their few belongings from the room and tossed them inside as well. I watched as he cuffed their hands behind their backs, making sure the chains were tangled together. He also gagged them with their undergarments. I closed the box and locked it up. They were packed so tightly, there was no way they could move, let alone escape. After finishing up, I checked my watch. "Do you have time to make it back before the test?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, no problem," I replied. "Let me know how it goes," he said. I thanked him and left as he wiped down everything he had touched. I made it to the test site just in time, where the military police escorted me in. "Thought you weren't going to make it, Cap," one of the guards remarked. "Just had to grab a quick bite before the test," I replied. They quickly checked the back of my truck and waved me through. "Take care, Cap," the guard said, giving me a salute. I returned it and drove in. I reached the tent where the weapon was being prepped for the test. Once I finished my task, I dismissed everyone as usual. Luckily, I parked the truck where my movements wouldn't be visible from the camera several miles away. Once I was certain everyone had left, I backed the truck up to the tent, opened it, lowered the ramp, and grabbed the dolly. It took some effort, but I managed to get the box centered on the dolly. It wasn't easy, I'll tell you that. Doris Svetlana didn't weigh much, but Mike was at least as heavy as I was, if not more. After a struggle, I got the box under the scaffolding that supported the weapon and noticed a metal plate running underneath it, probably for structural stability. At least it would conceal what was beneath the bomb, and that was all I cared about. I unlocked the box and cracked it open slightly. They were starting to wake up, blinking a few times before realizing it was me. Both of them looked pretty shocked as I knelt down beside them. "So," I said, "I guess you were eager to check out our atomic tech. Well, here it is. It's not much more powerful than the bombs we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it'll do the job. If it's any comfort, you won't feel a thing when it goes off. 1 second you're here, the next you're gone." "Just like that," I said, snapping my fingers. I could tell Doris Svetlana wanted to speak, so I pulled the gag from her mouth. "You imperialist pig!" she spat. I shoved Mike's underwear back into her mouth and laughed. "You lying, cheating commie biddy E.H., I replied. "I know all about you and Comrade Schmidt here. You've got about 15 minutes to make peace with whatever you commie pinkos believe in. Oh, and by the way, I want a divorce. Goodbye, and enjoy hell." Her eyes widened as I slammed the box shut and locked it tight. I knew there was no way they were getting out. After replacing the dolly, I removed the canvas tent, packed it into another metal box, and loaded it into my truck, just like I always did. I took one final look around before leaving the site the same way I had come. My hands were trembling, and I felt shaken inside. I took a few deep breaths and managed to calm myself a bit before reaching the protected observation area, where I parked the truck and headed inside. After grabbing my protective gear, I joined the rest of the observers, and we took the usual safety measures. Soon the countdown began, and I knew chaos would unfold in a matter of seconds. Sure enough, it did. I realized Doris Svetlana and her accomplice were now gone, vaporized, never to be seen or heard from again. Like everyone else, I waited a moment before looking, then watched the mushroom cloud rise into the sky. I used my binoculars to focus on ground zero, even though I knew there would be no evidence left of what I had done. Still, I felt compelled to look. Once everything settled, I moved through the monitoring stations like everyone else, returned the truck, and got into my car. I was still shaking by the time I made it home. I had never done anything like this in my life, and I was certain I was destined for hell. "It's done," I told James when I called him from the house. "Good," he said. "Give it a day or so, then report her missing. If you need to talk, let me know." "I will," I replied. "Thanks for everything." He laughed. "Just wait until you get my bill," he said. It was the first time I laughed all day. Pop stopped speaking and looked at me, his eyes filled with guilt and sorrow. I paused the recording. "It's all right, Pops," I said, hugging him. "You said yourself they intended to kill you once they were done. You didn't just save your own life, you protected the country from 2 hostile agents. There's nothing for you to feel ashamed of." He nodded. "I've been telling myself that for years," he replied. "But it still weighs on me, you know." "I know, Pops," I said. "But remember, we were at war. You did what you had to do. It was you or them. And personally, I'm glad it was you. Otherwise, we never would have met." I noticed a tear forming in his eye as he smiled. "I never thought of it that way, son," he said. "You're the bravest man I've ever known, Pops," I told him. "I'm proud of you." He hugged me tightly, and I could feel his tears soaking into my shirt. After a few moments, he wiped his eyes and looked at me. The guilt and sadness gone. "Maybe sharing this with you is what I needed all these years," he said. "I've carried that burden for so long." "I'm curious, though," I said. "What happened afterward?" "Well, I waited a couple of days and then filed a missing persons report," he explained. "They came back later and said they found her car at the motel, but no sign of her. They figured she might have run off with someone and said I'd probably never hear from her again." We both chuckled at that. "That would be quite the phone call," I said, making him laugh out loud. "So what happened next?" "I let a few months pass before visiting Capshaw on James's advice," he replied. "James and I thought it best for me to pretend the marriage was real, even though we knew it wasn't. Capshaw filed for divorce, citing abandonment. I went to Reno, and within minutes it was all finalized. On my way out of town, I stopped by the Truckee River and threw my wedding ring in, just as he had suggested. For years afterward, I half expected federal agents to show up, but they never did. I retired from government service in the 60s and started teaching. That's when I met Patricia. The rest is history. How did she stay in contact with her superiors? I asked. He shrugged. I have no idea, he said. I never found out. Doesn't really matter now, does it? Guess not, I replied. Our conversation ended when a nurse knocked on the door. She entered and said it was time for dinner, so I said my goodbyes. Be sure to bring that lovely girl of yours next time, he said. I will, Pops, I promised. Maybe tomorrow, if that's okay. I'll be looking forward to it, he said. That evening, Karen and I went out for dinner, drinks, and dancing. She brought a few things with her, including a large paper bag with a surprise inside. Later, after we made love in my apartment, she turned to me. Is everything all right, Trey? She asked. Yeah, why? I replied. It just seems like your mind is somewhere else, she said. What's on your mind? I visited Pops today, I said. He told me the rest of his story. Then I briefly recounted what he had shared with me. Wow, she remarked. Note to self, never get on his bad side. I laughed at that. How about we go see him tomorrow, maybe after I beat you at miniature golf? Sure, if you want, I replied. The next day we played a round of miniature golf, and yes, she won. And no, I didn't let her win. She would have seen right through that. Later, we visited Pops. She brought the bag along and took it inside the nursing home. His face lit up when he saw us walk in. Well, hello, young lady. He greeted her warmly as she gave him a big hug. I've got something for you, she said, handing him the paper bag. He opened it and pulled out a plastic container with an Afghan inside. She helped him unwrap it and took the Afghan out. I just finished this recently, she said. I know you love Afghans, so I made one just for you. He smiled as he held it. This is amazing, he said. Thank you, I love it. Then he turned to me. Son, if you don't marry this girl, I will, he said. You're absolutely right, Pops, I agreed. I took Karen's hand in mine, knelt down next to my grandfather, and looked into her eyes. Karen, I said, I'm completely in love with you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? She looked surprised at first, then her face lit up with a big smile. She threw her arms around my neck and kissed my face. Oh, yes, Trey, she exclaimed. I'll marry you. I love you so much. I love you too, I replied. We then heard applause and turned to see a group of nurses clapping and smiling. Pops joined in the applause as well. We got married a few months later, and the nursing home arranged for my grandfather to be brought to the church so he could celebrate with us. He gave me an envelope containing first-class tickets to Las Vegas and a reservation at a top hotel. A few months after that, his health declined, and he was moved to the hospice section of the nursing home. Karen and I spent as much time with him as possible. Even though his body was failing, I could see his mind was still sharp, and he no longer felt any guilt over his past. During my final visit, he was lucid enough to tell me that he had made peace with God and was ready to reunite with his beloved Patricia. Don't cry for me, son, he said softly. We'll be together again, I promise. I love you, son. I held him as he took his last breath. I couldn't stop myself from crying. I love you too, Pops, I managed to say through my tears. When I looked at his face, I saw that familiar, mischievous smile I had loved since I was a boy, and I knew he was in a better place. Karen came in and held me as we mourned together. He was buried in his military uniform with full honors beside his wife, Patricia. The honor guard folded the flag from his coffin and handed it to me with a salute. He had fought for his country and deserved all the honor he received, I thought. A few days later, I received a letter from his lawyer requesting that I visit his office. Intrigued by what he might want, I decided to go. "Your grandfather left everything to you," the lawyer explained. "His house, his money, everything. In total, it's quite a large amount, even after covering his final expenses. If you'd like, I can connect you with a financial advisor to help manage it. He also wanted me to give you this," he continued, handing me a large, sealed envelope that appeared quite old. "I've kept it in my safe for years. I don't know what's inside. Your grandfather instructed that it only be opened after his death." "Thanks," I replied. "And yes, I'd like to meet with your financial advisor," I added after seeing the substantial inheritance Pops had left behind. I didn't open the envelope until I got home, and what I found inside left me stunned. It turns out Pops had kept everything, including a copy of a report written by James Ham and a yellowed divorce decree declaring his separation from Doris Harrison, formerly Hastings, on the grounds of abandonment. There was even a photo of the house they once lived in. That evening, Karen and I went through it all, still in disbelief. It turned out that everything Pops had told me was true. The final document appeared to be a photocopy of an old official report in Russian, seemingly part of a large cache of documents released by the former Soviet KGB. Attached to it was an English translation. As far as I could tell, it was a series of field reports from someone named Svetlana Fedorova, informing her superiors in Moscow that she suspected her target, Pops, might have figured out her true identity. Earlier reports mentioned that she had gotten close to someone deeply involved in America's atomic weapons program. Though she never named Pops directly, it was clear she was frustrated at being unable to extract any useful information, telling her superiors that all he seemed interested in was having intimacy and watching capitalist television. Later dispatches reflected increasing frustration, with her superiors instructing her to take a more aggressive approach. Her final report indicated that she and Michelle were planning something drastic. "I'll deal with him as soon as possible," she informed her superiors. Karen and I had a good laugh at that. The KGB report noted that neither Fedorova nor her German-born assistant was ever heard from again. They speculated the two had run off together to get married, but they were simply never found. The operation was labeled dead. "They really have no idea," I said, making Karen laugh.